And I think it's not surprising to imagine that incoming groups of Homo sapiens there were just too many of them, and they disappeared fairly quickly from the biological story. The same probably goes for Homo luzonensis. Denisovans are a different case in point. We have a lot of evidence to suggest that there were multiple populations of Denisovans, and also that Homo sapiens groups interbred with those populations quite regularly and over quite a long period of time, perhaps as recently as 20,000 years ago. So I think perhaps that Denisovans may have been a different kind of story of disappearance. But again, there is so much we just don't know. The fossil record is very fragmentary, and we still have a lot of work to do before we can really understand the chronology of all of these disappearances and why then they may have occurred in the past.
Can we tell what type of characteristics we may have from them or from the Neanderthals?
Yes, we have a lot of evidence from again from the genetics. The DNA evidence has been really informative, and we now are tracking some of the differences that we have in our genomes between the two or the three groups that we have reliable nuclear DNA evidence from. And so, for example, if you take the Denisovans, we know that there are some really important immunological adaptations that they had compared to us. They had a lot of gene variants that conferred advantages in terms of being able to withstand perhaps pathogens, illnesses, viruses, and diseases in tropical environments. So we think they were quite adapted to the tropical biomes of the world, particularly in places like Island Southeast Asia and Melanesia. So that was quite significant. We know that Neanderthals gave us some DNA that codes for various things like improved quality of skin, hair, collagen, and so on. So we have evidence that perhaps Neanderthals were quite well adapted to colder environments, and perhaps this gave us some benefit when we interbred with them. But we also know that we have some deleterious or negative genetic inheritances as well. So, for example, with Neanderthals, we know that they gave us genes that are linked with type 2 diabetes, with addictive behaviors, like, for example, smoking addictions, for specific illnesses that obviously aren't beneficial to us. So there's a lot of work being done at the moment in looking at these differences. And skull shapes, we have evidence that Neanderthal skull shapes live on in groups and populations of living people today. So there's a lot of stuff that we're just at the beginning of understanding, and it's a very exciting time to be working in this field because of the insights it gives us into what they were like compared to what we are currently like after having met these groups and interbred with them and inherited some of their DNA.
Not to become too scientific, because then I can't follow. But how do we know what part of the DNA is from them and what is from other species?
Yeah. So it's all to do with the long tracts of DNA that are sequenced in laboratories now. There's been an incredible revolution in our ability to sequence large amounts of DNA. In the old days, it was very, very difficult to get DNA sequences that could be relied upon as being from the bone of a Neanderthal, for example, or from the bone of an ancient human. And this is because of the overwhelming problems and challenges of contamination of DNA. Most of the DNA you get is in the lab is from bacteria. It's not from the human. And so a series of revolutions took place in terms of instrumentation and the chemical preparation work that was able to be done in DNA labs, which meant that it was now possible to get huge amounts of authentic DNA. And so what you get is these long stretches of millions and millions of codes, letters that correlate to the bases of the genetic code, which gives instruction to life. And so it's a numbers game. Bioinformaticians look at all these numbers, they align them, and they compare specific parts of the genome and the differences. So it's possible to look very closely along the line of these 3.2 billion base pairs and find the differences in terms of these single bases that are expressed between us and between a Neanderthal. And then, based on where they are in the genome to figure out what that means in terms of the gene, the alleles, and what that is in terms of reflecting behavior, physical appearance, and so on and so forth. So we know a lot about genes now from the Human Genome Project. We can figure out, which gene codes for this and what genes make us look like we look, and so on. And so it's possible to focus on these variable regions of the genome where we know what these genes function, what the gene function is, and compare it to Neanderthals and work out why we're different and how we're different. And so it's really fascinating. A lot of scientists are working now on understanding more about the differences in these genes and the function and what they might give us. And people have been, for example, growing kind of proto brains and inserting Neanderthal genes and alleles into certain parts of these proto brains to see how they impact on the development of brain tissue, for example. And so we can understand how a Neanderthal might have been different cognitively, perhaps, from a Homo sapiens. So there's a huge amount of work going on at the moment to understand the sort of nuts and bolts of how all this works in reality.
That is so amazing to me that is possible. So detailed, but
Yeah.
so big.
Yeah, I know. It is really amazing. I'll give you a really cool example. We have this gene called FOXP2. It's like without this gene, you can't really speak. Speech is very, very difficult without it. And so it turns out that Neanderthals have this FOXP2 gene as well. This part of this variant of FOXP2. And as I say, without it, it's not possible to be able to communicate effectively. So in order to understand the effect of FOXP2, you can use a mouse and you can use gene knockout treatments to put the human FOXP2 into a mouse to see how it reacts and what it does, what the effect is. And it turns out that when you give a mouse the human version of FOXP2, it turns out that there is a definitive change in the length to which they squeak, for example. So it's just an example of how you can work out what the impact is of a change in the genetic fingerprint, I guess, of a human or a Neanderthal can have in real terms, and understand more about the makeup of our DNA and their DNA and how it's different and what that in fact gives us.
So it makes for more
Difference.
complex and detailed communication, and therefore
Yeah, exactly.
squeaks.
It could be something significant, and there are lots of these differences that we now want to understand more about. So I hasten to say I'm not a geneticist. I wish I was sometimes, but I try and follow the science as closely as I can.
That's super interesting. If when Neanderthals and then now humans interbreded, did they also live in the same tribes? Did they live together?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's so difficult to know the answer. Back in 2014, we published a big study in which we looked at the dates of Neanderthal archaeological sites and modern human or Homo sapiens archaeological sites. And we found that the distribution was kind of a mosaic. These two groups overlapped in time for several thousand years, which was a big surprise to us. So we think that there were different groups in different parts of Eurasia and that they didn't live in the same site at all times. Otherwise, we'd find their remains sort of commingled together. And we don't always do that. We don't find their remains side by side or their definitive, distinctive stone tools mixed up together in the same archaeological site. So, but of course, we do know that they interbred, and to interbreed, you have to be in the same place. I mean, it's impossible not to, right? And so we in 2018. I was part of this discovery of this incredible human bone from a site called Denisovo Cave in Russia, in Siberia, which was shown genetically to be the daughter of a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. So this was a sort of a hybrid person with the parents coming from two different human groups. It was an incredible discovery. And it made us realize that at this site, people were living at the same time. Neanderthal groups and Denisovans were present in this place at the same time. And later, with the development of incredible new sediment DNA approaches, so it's possible now to extract DNA from sediments from archaeological sites. It's possible to pull out sediments from different human groups from the same archaeological dirt, as it were.
Hmm.
And when this has been done, it's been possible to find that sites like Denisova have sometimes Denisovans living, and then Neanderthals coming in later, and then replaced by Denisovans, and then later Neanderthals, and so on. And I think it's not, we shouldn't be surprised to expect that at least at some periods there would be both groups present. So I think that the answer to the question is there may have been times when both groups were living at the same place at the same time. But overwhelmingly, we kind of feel from the evidence in the main suggests that it was more a case of one group living at the same site more often than not. They weren't living together, because if they were all together at the same time, their DNA would be the same. There would be a population, and we don't see that. The DNA is distinctive, and we think that they occasionally met and interbred, but for the most part, they were separate.
Makes sense. I have to ask, maybe it's a dumb question, but
No.
These human types, does it mean they develop more or less at the same time from the apes, or were they somewhat developing within each other from another human species?
Yeah. So, well, the story of evolution is all about separation, and when you separate two different populations, they tend to evolve in slightly different ways. And so, for example, for the last 300,000, half a million years, you can imagine that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals shared a common ancestor, but at some point they became separated. Neanderthals living in Europe and Eurasia, and Homo sapiens living in Africa.